Welcome, everyone. I'm Robert Wilonsky, Director of Communications here at Heritage Auctions, and I'm incredibly delighted to be joined here for our State of the Photography Market discussion by Nigel Russell, who is the Director of Photography here at Heritage Auctions. Nigel, it's great to see you.
Great to see you, and great to be here.
I apologize for the bit of a blurry view I have, but that said, it's probably just as well for many people who watch this, because I think I am best now viewed through what looks to be a gauzy filter, as though I were perhaps in a 70s romantic comedy of some kind. This is a real thrill for me, man. I have to say that after spending 30 years in print journalism, I think the most talented people I worked with were the photographers that I had the pleasure of calling colleagues and friends. Many of their photographs actually decorate the office in which I'm currently sitting. And it's a great thrill to talk about the photography market. And I have questions for you. I'm sure a lot of folks have questions for you. If you want to do so, you can drop them here. That's very easy to do so. Just add a comment or ask a question. But if you'd like to do it anonymously, feel free to do that at tommyn@ha.com. That's Tommy Noel, who's directing this. Tommy will feed your questions to us. Nigel's going to have a lot of things to talk about. In fact, Nigel, I have to say, this may be one of the first state of the market discussions we've done where somebody has slideshows prepared that actually discuss the history of their particular market. So this is really exciting for me, man. I'm delighted you could do this.
Yeah, I go back to slide projectors and 35mm slides.
Well, as long as maybe next time when we're in the same space, you're in New York, I'm here in Dallas, but maybe next time we do one of these, we can actually get a slide projector out and actually do it that way. That actually might be a lot of fun. In fact, if I had known that that's how you might have wanted to do this, that's probably how I would have demanded we do it. But that said, look, obviously, photography is a relatively new collecting area in as much as that it doesn't date back hundreds or thousands of years. So I'd like to begin this discussion, if you don't mind, by discussing how you got into it and sort of what changes you've seen since it became something that people didn't just appreciate, but began to collect as well.
Well, how I personally got into this was my father wanted me to be a doctor.
But, join the club.
Yeah, but I wanted to be a photographer, and my father thought being a photographer was the same thing as running away and joining the circus. So I looked around, and there was one program at that time in the United States called Photographic Science and Instrumentation at the Rochester Institute of Technology. So I went there to study optics and lenses and photochemistry and, you know, all the engineering side of photography. But in Rochester is the George Eastman House Museum, one of the few museums dedicated to the history of photography. And I just fell in love with the history of photography. And when I left college, I thought I would try to find a job doing that.
Did you ever have any interest in actually being a photographer, being a professional photographer?
I always felt that I probably wasn't good enough. I had a bit of doubt. So
really?
Yeah. It's funny because I look at what sometimes we get submitted, and I think I could have done better than that.
Well, I hate to tell you that when my son was 8 years old, he had photographs published in the Dallas Morning News and the Dallas Observer. So,
wow.
You know, just so you know, it's you got to have the right eye. I was always told that Harry had a good eye for the thirds, the rule of threes. So I think perhaps there's something to be said about that. When did you get into, and how did you get into, and what changes have you found in the world of collecting of photography? Because certainly there are names people know, there are iconic images that people certainly collect, and if you get a print as opposed to, you know, there are certainly many different kinds of things that folks collect in the realm of photography. So talk to me a little bit about how all of this has changed and when it really became something that people put their eye toward, as it were.
So it's a little hard for people to understand, but before the 1970s, there really wasn't a photography art market. You know, a photographer took photographs, you know, hoping to sell his photographs to a magazine or a newspaper. There weren't photography galleries. There weren't people, thinking about making photographs to sell as fine art. As a result, photographers didn't do limited editions or things like that before there were the beginning of the photography galleries and auctions in the 70s. People will always ask me, a photograph that was taken in the 1930s or 1950s. Well, how many are there? How many prints are there? And I have to tell them, we don't know. We don't know how many the photographer actually printed. All we can do is we can look at the auction records and see, this photograph has only one ever comes up every 10 years. So it must be pretty rare. So anyway, yeah, the very first auctions that started were sales of private collections. There were a few early collectors who collected anything related to the history of photography. They were really more interested in the technical history of photography. Yeah, so these auctions, for instance, had cameras, viewers, optical toys, albums, individual photographs. It was a real mixture. They were really interested in just a broad history of photography. And then when in the late 70s, when photography auctions started to be regularly scheduled, the emphasis was on 19th century photographs, historical photographs. And that continued, throughout the 80s. And what happened was there was a gradual shift. People's interests changed from collecting historical 19th century photographs to collecting 20th century photographs by well-known photographers. And actually the histories of photography were being written at that time, so they were sort of pointing out to you who was considered to be an important photographer.
Well, that's interesting, because certainly I think when one thinks of the market now, I keep kind of coming back to the idea of what makes a photo valuable. Is it the image? Is it the rarity of that print? Is it the photographer? Is it the situation in which it was taken? Certainly much of the 20th century, 19th and 20th centuries are defined by the photographs taken. Again, coming from a journalism background, for me, stories are written and stories are forgotten, but those photographs are indelible. They live forever. We collect them, we hang them, we display them, we discuss them. They are, for many people, that which defines the moment, the era, and the importance of it. So, over the course of your career doing this, what have you found is there a defining feature toward what makes a photo collectible and valuable?
It's actually there's several factors involved. It can be, there's the photographer, whether that photographer is, well known or not. Then there's the actual image. Is it an image that people consider important or desirable? And then the age of the image. In other words, was the print made at the time the photographer took it, or is it like a later print, or even a print made after the photographer's death? And then there's just general rarity. Some photographs are just much rarer than others. The photographer didn't make very many prints. Condition, of course, is always important in anything. Something that's not creased is going to be worth more than something that has a big crease in it. And then processes. There are different photographic processes. Some are more desirable than others. The usual is a gelatin silver print, but there's also like a premium process called a platinum print, and people will pay extra if the photographer printed in both gelatin silver and platinum. Size is very important in photography. Size does matter. The bigger the print, the more it's going to sell for. People like large prints. Provenance, the history of something. A photograph that was, found in a flea market with no history is not going to be worth as much as something that came directly from the photographer's family, where there's sort of written proof that it came from the photographer directly. Historical context, that's a little bit trickier. That's basically, how does this photograph fit into the whole history of photography? You can have somebody who's shooting nowadays, currently shooting in a style of Ansel Adams, but his photographs are not going to be worth as much because he didn't do it first. The photographer who did it first, or who is historically important, their photographs tend to be worth more. And then there's this, abstract quality of desirability. There's some photographs that, even if they're not that rare, they still have, people want them. People want the raising of the flag on Iwo Jima. Even though prints come up fairly regularly, it's still a desirable image.
But all of that is obviously fairly malleable, in as much as that if someone were to turn up with a garage sale or a thrift store photograph the size of a postage stamp of Robert Johnson, of whom there are just 2 or 3 photos known, certainly it is, the context of which that photo was taken, where it was found, and who it is of, or what moment it is of, correct?
Yeah, I mean, everything has to be weighed. So
Right.
If something is incredibly rare, even though it doesn't have any history behind it, you have to weigh that. I often get people saying, they have another photograph of Billy the Kid. Well, there's only one known photograph of Billy the Kid that actually has provenance that traces back to his family, and that went for $2 million. Yeah, so it can be very important.
So you do raise an interesting diversion for me, if you do not mind indulging me for a moment. Over the course of your career doing this, do you get that a lot? This is you won't believe what I found. It's the only photograph of so-and-so, or it's the second photograph of this. It was found, or something that was found in a thrift store of this incredibly historic moment. And what is that like for you? Because I imagine your job, like many of our jobs, is sort of detective work, in that it leads you down some fairly interesting paths and down some pretty fascinating rabbit holes.
Yes, it does. I mean, we get, quite frequently get offered, something like a photograph of Jesse James, or a photograph, previously unpublished photographs of Marilyn Monroe. They're Abraham Lincoln, previously unknown photograph of Abraham Lincoln. I will tell you honestly, most of the time, there just isn't enough proof to say, yes, definitely, that's Abraham Lincoln. People will spend money to have a facial recognition specialist write a report, but still, collectors, if they're going to spend a large sum of money, want more than that. They want something that ties it directly to Lincoln or his family or an associate.
Do you find that's also the case with photographs? This is a never before seen photograph by Richard Avedon or Ansel Adams or Annie Leibovitz. These photographs, obviously, or from a magazine. Certainly, I assume that is a thing that's harder to prove, a thing that's harder to prove provenance, a thing that's more difficult because they're not signed, they're not stamped, they are not, they're just more difficult to sort of show that they are as special as one might hope they are.
Well, certainly, if it's a well-known photographer like Annie Leibovitz or Richard Avedon or Irving Penn, we just can't sell it if it's not signed or stamped. In fact, there are for Avedon and Penn, they have foundations that will authenticate something. And if something isn't signed or stamped, they usually will say, that we shouldn't sell it.
Let's talk a little bit about prints, because I've been fascinated by prints since I got here. Certainly the negative can exist for X amount of years, but certainly prints can be made indefinitely. I assume that a photograph is more valuable or more coveted the closer it is made to the time the photo was actually taken.
That's correct. It's what's called in collecting a vintage print. And the idea of a vintage print is that it was something that the photographer printed, around the time that he took the actual photograph. And the reasoning being that a vintage print, an early print, is probably more what the artist, the photographer, intended, the way he first visualized the print should look. And so, like, here we have an example of an Edward Weston Pepper. If you manage to find one of these that Edward Weston printed himself during his lifetime, these can go for, $300,000. After he died, his son continued to print these, and they're worth, much less, almost 1/100th the price.
See, I'm fascinated by that because it's still the same image taken by the same photographer. It just was printed decades earlier. I'm utterly fascinated by that. If one wanted to collect that, or an Avedon or an Ansel Adams, it certainly behooves one to get one printed by the photographer close to the time of its taking. I find that to be fascinating.
If people want something that the photographer actually touched, actually printed himself, actually signed, rather than his son or grandson.
I see we have a question here from Del Zog, who asks, who are the photographers whose markets are still developing? This is obviously a subject we'll get to here as well over the course of this conversation, Del, but thanks for asking. And I'll just say this. Del asks, I think of artists who were well known in the 70s, 80s, and 90s who are being rediscovered. So that's one of the great things about doing these Q&As live, is that Nigel can ask these on the fly, answer these on the fly, and you guys can ask them as many as you'd like. So Nigel, we'll divert from our conversation here so you can answer Del's question.
Well, let's see. Well, I mean, I think it's two parts. One is, which contemporary photographers our markets are growing. I can tell you that, well, certainly, I mean, it's very difficult to tell with let's say a real contemporary photographer. I mean, somebody who is their work is in the galleries right now and it's very fresh. It's, they've only been, let's say, had gallery representation for, a few years. It's really difficult to tell which of those contemporary photographers are going to stand the test of time. I can think of many photographers who were hot, let's say 20 years ago, whose markets is just not there now. But on the other hand, there are a few that have really gone up. Peter Beard has always had a strong market, but since he died last year, his market is even stronger. And then photographers from the 70s, 80s, 90s that are being rediscovered, that often has to do with, let's say, gallery shows or museum shows. So if a museum does a retrospective on, let's say, Aaron Siskin, who was a photographer in the 50s and 60s, you might see a bump in the price of his photographs. Yeah, I mean, it really depends on museum. Oftentimes, museum shows.
Right. So, I think this is a fascinating discussion to have at this particular moment, because certainly over the last 16 months, You know, and I've thought about this a great deal as I look at a lot of the artwork that I have to get framed or that I have framed and have yet to hang in my house over the last several months. You know, certainly as many people were at home and may yet be returning home again, there is this sense that I need to go through my collection. I need to refresh what I own. I want to reevaluate who I collect, and I want to make my house look different. Have you found that that has had a significant impact on the value of and interest in the photography market?
Well, I certainly have I certainly have found that during the last year, people had a lot of extra time, and they weren't traveling, they weren't going to restaurants, so there has been a recent strength in the market. Certainly at the high end, people are sort of saying, let me sell these photographs that I don't really look at anymore, and I'm going to put it into something that I've always wanted. So yeah, we're also seeing people consigning because they were moving out of the city and living in their second homes, and they don't need those photographs on the walls anymore. So yeah, no, there has been a churning of the market in the last, really starting even before the pandemic, of older collectors selling their collections and newer collectors coming into the market. Yeah, we have seen some good strength in the last year or so.
Well, let's talk about trends overall in the last several years, if not the last couple of decades, and let's look at sort of the state of the current market, because I'm sure people would like to see some photographs. You certainly have chosen a lovely selection for us to look at. So, if you don't mind, I'm fascinated by, and you had shown me earlier, the Photo Collector Comparative Auction Index from 1975 to 2003. Which I found its numbers kind of staggering. So could you talk a little bit about that, and let's get to the current market?
Okay, this was done by Stephen Perloff at the Photo Collector, and what he did was he had this interesting idea of taking a group of photographs that were appearing at auction fairly regularly, so you could sort of track their value over time. Let's say like an Ansel Adams Moonrise, where there's at least one or two that are sold every year. And so with this basket of photographs, he was able to show that there was a steady increase in the value of photographs, and it actually did almost 3 times better than putting your money in the stock market. What happened around 2003 was contemporary photography started to become more and more important in the photography art market. More people started collecting contemporary. And the auctions started to have more contemporary work. So then he had this problem, what to do with the basket of photographs. Do you throw out the photographs from the 1970s and put in photographs from the 2000s, and then if the sampling of photographs is different, then can you still compare year over year? And basically he thought it became too complicated, and he stopped in 2003. Since that time, what happened was photographs continued to rise until the Great Recession, really sort of hitting a peak in 2006, 2008. And then a lot of the traditional black and white photography of the 20th century actually got hit quite hard after the recession, collectors and dealers. So, I mean, a good example would be that Edward Weston that we were showing before. The vintage print, the price remained strong, and in fact grew, because there are extremely few vintage prints, and they're very desirable. The Cole Weston print, on the other hand, the market after 2006, 2008 actually dropped a little bit. So they were actually selling for less, a couple of years ago than they were in, 2006. It's starting to go back up again, but it's there was a bit of a depression.
So what accounts for that recent uptick? Is it the fact that there has been a pandemic that has forced people to sort of reevaluate that which they collect and look at?
I think so, and I think that there are people now who it kind of swang a little, the pendulum. They were collecting contemporary, but they still want some of that classic black and white 20th century photography.
That seems to include Ansel Adams. I know Ansel Adams is, I guess, a photographer who never falls out of favor. You were talking about Moonrise a moment ago. I believe Moonrise does better now than it may have done a couple of years ago. Yes,
that's correct. This slide here shows you that size matters. Basically, a smaller print will sell for less than a large print. And he even made a few mural size prints, very large prints, and those can go for $300,000 for one of his really large prints.
Tommy, if you don't mind, could you show us Moonrise as well? That was Sunrise, but Moonrise from there you go, from Hernandez, New Mexico, 1941. Obviously, a very, very iconic photograph.
Yeah, this is to show you that how important the image is. So even a photographer like Ansel Adams has some duds, let's say, some photographs that are just not as popular, just not as interesting. So these photographs are by Ansel Adams. They're about the same size, but of course Moonrise, very desirable, $30,000 to $50,000. Petroglyphs, rock paintings, $2,000 to $3,000. So you can, if you want an unusual image, get an inexpensive Ansel Adams.
Right, but it's just one of the boring ones.
Yeah.
See, that again fascinates me. It is the question of, do you collect the art or do you collect the artist?
And an example of that, I think we have a slide of Ruth Orkin. This is the photographer. This is a young American girl in Florence. Sorry, and I consider Ruth Orkin a bit of a one-hit wonder. I mean, this is the photograph that she's known for. This is the photograph that everybody wants. Whenever it comes up for auction, it sells well. She has a whole other body of work of photographs of Central Park that just don't sell well. They sell for a fraction of this. So she's the opposite of, let's say, an Ansel Adams. She has one really great photograph.
Is it easy these days? Certainly, when it comes to sports cards, there are grading services. When it comes to comic books, there are grading services that keep population reports. Is it easy to keep track of how many prints there are of a particular piece on the market and when those prints were made? How does one determine? I see there that with the Orkin, for instance, that's a 51 photograph, but that print, as you note there, was made in 1978 or 1983. I'm sorry. So walk me through that a little bit in terms of discovering how that was, how many there are known to be on the market of that particular one-hit wonder, and how we know it's from 83.
Well, before the internet, there were you either had to have a huge collection of auction catalogs and spend a lot of time thumbing through them and seeing what things sold for in the past, or you had a very good memory. Or there was a something called Gordon's Photograph Index, which was like phone book size and was very expensive, and you had to go to the library to look up auction records. Then ArtNet, then the internet came along and ArtNet. And so ArtNet is a database of auction records. For photographs, they go back to around 1990. So we've got about 30 years of auction records. And so you can look up Ruth Orkin's American Girl in Florence and see when it was sold, the different prices for the different editions, and you can get an idea that way. But basically, auction estimates are based on what things have sold for in the past.
Right. But talk to me a little about what obviously if it's signed, if it's numbered, you certainly know from what year it comes. Is there a process by which one can say, well, all right, this print is more contemporary with the making of with the taking of the photograph, as opposed to its more recent printings, its more recent vintage?
Well, certainly you can tell a 1930s print from a 1970s or 80s
Sure.
print. 1930s prints, the paper is a bit different. There's something called a blacklight test, where you can use a blacklight. And what was discovered by a conservator called Paul Messier is that starting in the mid-1950s, photography manufacturers, Kodak, Agfa, the people that made the paper, started to include optical brighteners in the paper. So it's the same thing that makes your T-shirt glow in the disco under black light. They put optical brighteners in the detergent.
That is a very specific reference, Nigel.
Anyway, so
we need to hang out more often.
Yeah. Yeah, so they did the same thing with photographic paper. So if somebody is telling you that this is a vintage Andre Cortege photograph printed in the 1930s, and you take it into a dark room and put a black light against it and it glows like the moon, something's wrong. Yeah, it's a later print. Got it.
So I do want to let's talk about the current market. I'm sure that's why a lot of folks have tuned in and will watch this when it replays on YouTube, when it's archived on YouTube. But I do want to talk about the market. We've talked a couple of times about Ansel Adams. We've talked about Moonrise. In April, I believe we sold one for about $68,000. A couple of years ago, that was about $18,000. It sold for $18,000 less. And I'm curious what accounts for that dramatic uptick in just the last 2 years in that particular photograph.
It is desirability. People want this photograph. I mean, there can be subtle differences. In Ansel Adams collectors are very finicky about condition. So if there's even just a tiny little blemish, that can affect the value. When it was printed, again, he has stamps on the back, and some people will pay more for whether it's a late 60s print as opposed to a late 70s print. But I think in most of that increase in value is just the fact that it's a desirable photograph, and people seem to be spending more on their collections in the last year or so.
I assume that is also what counts for, I believe, Aspen's northern New Mexico. We saw the same uptick. I think it went for about $22,000 in April of 2020. 3 years prior, it had gone for about $13,000.
Yeah, very, very similar. Very similar. He's one of the photographers that, I mean, he's always had a good market, but I think there is an upsurge at the moment where people will pay for those iconic Ansel Adams images.
Do you find that that's probably, we certainly see that in comic books, Batman #1, Detective 27, people want the landmark moment. They want it by the landmark photographer, artist, writer, and so forth. You see it certainly over the last year or so when it comes to sports cards, the 52 mantle. You see it when it comes to any number of collectibles. They want the most familiar, the most famous, the most iconic, the most definitive. Is that what's happening in, even in American art, illustration art, with the Lion Decker that we just sold for over $4 million? One of the most defining portraits of that period. Do you find that that is just the case at this particular moment? It is about going back to the best of the best.
You can't go wrong buying the best.
Right.
I think that goes across every market if you can afford it. But I mean, we've seen this with Alfred Eisenstadt, his puppet theater. We've seen a rise in that price, and also a rise in VJ Day.
Well, Children at a Puppet Theater is one of my favorite pieces. I know we sold that in April for about $32,000, which is significantly more than it sold for just a few years ago, right?
Right. Very desirable photograph. Everybody loves that. It makes them smile. And when we sold this one recently, I had a few people who were bidding on it who were saying, I've always wanted this photograph. I've been putting it off, but now I've finally decided is the time to buy it.
Really?
Yeah.
I love this photograph for any number of reasons. Before we move on, I'm curious, what do you love most about it?
Well, I mean, I always think to myself, what is this puppet show that it's just so entertaining? I mean, there are, you can just look at all the faces in the background. Everybody's got a unique expression. And
my favorite is the little girl second to the right who looks as startled as anyone could possibly look. Everyone else looks amused, bemused, delighted. She looks like she just cannot believe she has ever seen anything like what is currently taking place on the other side of the camera.
Yeah, she's never seen anything like this before.
If the photo had just been of her, I probably would love it just as much.
There are, he actually took, a few photographs of the show, and there is an alternative version which focuses just on those two. And it's charming, but it just doesn't sell as well as this one.
See, I think that goes to kind of what we're talking about here. It's about that iconic photograph as opposed to the alternative version. Certainly, there are many photographs taken of something that, being a native of Dallas, there are two photographs of the assassination of Lee Harvey Oswald. One of them is the Pulitzer Prize-winning version. The other one is the other version. It is about being at that particular moment, at that particular angle, at that particular place, at that particular time.
And it's that intangible thing where, you look at the photograph and it just works. You don't know whether it's the angle or the lighting, but there's something about it that just makes it special. Absolutely.
That VJ Day photo you talked about as well, it also has seen a dramatic uptick. I think it's $10,000 more. It sold for $10,000 more in April than it did in just 4 years ago.
Yeah, again, a lot of that's desirability. This one also, I would attribute some of that increase to the provenance of this one that we just recently sold. It came from somebody who worked for Time Life Books and was working with Eisenstadt. So it was a gift. It was a gift to her, and it's a little bit earlier than the usual prints. The usual prints were done in like 1981, and this was printed in 1978.
See, I'm fascinated by that because I would think that there's a certain point at which people, though I've seen this photograph so much, I never need to look at it. I don't need to own it because it's so seared in the consciousness. And yet, obviously, and it's not printed contemporaneously with the making of the photograph, obviously. So I am sort of curious, the provenance of it. This this seems to be a real sort of collaboration of provenance and iconography itself, and not to mention the photographer.
Yeah, I mean, in this case, I would say the fact that it was given by Eisenstadt to someone who worked with him at Time Life Books,
Right.
Helped the price. But still, most of it is the image. People, maybe you've seen it, a 1,000 times before and don't need to own it, but other people feel it's, a great patriotic moment and they want it on their wall.
No, I think that's really kind of the fascinating thing. It's so much about personal preference. It's so much about, to me, photography is such an incredibly personal thing. And it's interesting because this is one of the few things that we all do ourselves, right? We all have phones. We are all now photographers. We're all now photojournalists. We all now document every moment, and we all put it on Instagram and think that we know what defines great photography and great art. And this is one of the few things that you can buy that you actually participate in.
Yeah, and speaking of phones, it's been more challenging since the digital age to explain to people why a photograph is valuable.
Really?
When they can take, a few hundred photographs every day on their phone, to explain that, no, actually people will spend $50,000 for a print that's done by the photographer of a famous image. It's different than the hundreds of thousands of images you see every day on social media.
See, I find that to be utterly fascinating. And look, as someone who as a journalist took photographs for my own stories often, and you took them for Twitter, this is, you just tried to make it so you weren't embarrassed by the photograph you took, because certainly I worked with great photographers and know what makes great photography. When it comes to contemporary photographs, you were mentioning a moment ago Peter Beard. Peter Beard is certainly someone whose value has increased of late, I believe. So there's certainly still a market for, an understanding of, an appreciation for contemporary photography.
Oh yes, there are. Yeah, this is a Peter Beard. Peter Beard is a very unique artist. He was a mixture of a conservationist and a playboy.
I always wish someone would say that about me one day.
What he did was, even though he took, photographs, which you consider, are multiples, that you have the negative, you can make as many prints as you want. What he did was he makes each one unique, because he adds collage and embellishment, and sometimes his own blood or animal blood, so that each photograph is unique. So that increases the value of these, because you can have another copy of this photograph, but it's not going to be the same. It's not going to have the same collage around the edges, the same amount of blood.
Yes, that's always what I look for in a photograph, by the way, Nigel.
There was one Peter Beard photograph where he was gored really badly by an elephant, and almost died. But there's one photograph collage of his experience in the hospital, and he has the hypodermic needle stuck to the photograph, and his saline solution bag is attached to the photograph. He's really they're really autobiographical, his photographs.
Right. So I'm curious, obviously Peter Beard is significantly different from a Peter Lindbergh, who's also, I believe, doing very, very well. I believe in October we sold the Linda Evangelista for $55,000, if I'm not mistaken. Is that because that is an iconic image? Is that because it's the photographer? Certainly that Evangelista image is it's taken for commercial purposes. It's seen quite a bit, but certainly what makes this such a coveted piece that it did so significantly well in October?
It's actually it's actually an area that I kind of struggle a bit with. But people love these photographs of supermodels.
Well, you don't find that surprising.
Yeah, these edgy, but it's by a few well-known. I guess it sort of started with Helmut Newton, but yeah, these supermodels, famous photographer, sort of edgy photographs, or not sort of your what you would think of as being typical. Like, I don't know what the expression on her face is, but I don't think I would want to have a conversation with her right at that moment. She looks a little angry.
Probably with Peter Lindbergh, or somebody who's working with Peter Lindbergh at that moment.
But yeah, they're very desirable.
And what about Marilyn Minter? I want to talk to you a little bit about, I think, is it Pink Mist from 2006, a piece that I know you had brought up previously, and that I was kind of interested in discussing as well. Because people are asking, obviously, over the course of this conversation, who are some of the more contemporary artists that one should pay attention to?
Marilyn Minter, she definitely has her own style. I think that's also sort of key to a lot of these contemporary photographers, is you have to have someone who you can look at their photograph and almost know immediately who took it. So she does a lot of this glitter. It's women. Again, these are all very large, and yeah, they're glitzy. They look nice in your beach house.
I think you're not my beach house. I just want to be very clear about that, Nigel.
Okay. But they sell very well because they, in a modern apartment or house, they just look stunning on the wall.
So that raises the question of, as we look at the Evangelista piece by Lindbergh, as we look at these other pieces, is there a thing toward which people are particularly gravitating? And I ask this because the Vic Muniz piece I want to talk about as well is photojournalism. This is Orphan Girl at a Cemetery. When we talk about, I collect photojournalism but then again, I love the portraiture taken by photojournalist friends of mine. So I do sort of wonder over the course of this last year or so, if there was any one particular trend, if you saw people gravitating towards something that was realistic, if you saw people gravitating something that was surrealistic, that was of something familiar, iconic, or comforting, that made them sort of reevaluate what they were interested in and what they were consigning.
I wouldn't say that, pleasing photographs of kitties sell better than photographs of disasters, because
I don't mean that.
But
that's a phrase I didn't expect to hear during this conversation, by the way.
But so yeah, I can't really say that a particular genre of photographs is selling better than another, but I will say that people are. It's a mixture of kind of on the one hand spending more than they have in the last few years, so prices have gone up, but also being a little cautious in doing that and wanting to spend the money on a contemporary photographer who has a good track record, like Vic Muniz or Marilyn Minter or Peter Beard, somebody who you can see, their photographs have, even though, let's say, they're stronger now, they've always sold pretty well. So yeah, sometimes I think people are a little less interested in taking a risk on a relatively unknown photographer at the moment.
Is that something, obviously, you would encourage folks to do at this point?
Well, I mean, I always encourage people to you usually can't go wrong buying what you like.
Well, that is what we tell people, right? Buy what you love, not what you think will be more expensive 2 years from now than it was today.
Right. And that's more true, with contemporary than anything else, because you will buy 10 photographs, and 20 years from now, perhaps 8 of those are not worth as much as inflation or whatever, but 2 of those will have really appreciated in value. But you've had the joy of those photographs all through those years.
Tommy, can you bring up the Vic Muniz while I ask a couple of final questions of Nigel here? Is there something in particular that you collect, that you look for, that you have found your tastes gravitating to in the last couple of years?
Oh, I am what you would call an opportunist collector. I usually collect something when I just stumble across it and I think, gee, I love that photograph and it's a good price. So yeah, I'm not collecting in an organized way. I used to collect a lot of photography books, but once you've moved 3,000 books to another location, you stop doing that.
Right. Well, do you also find that there are that people who are consigning with us are consigning in a different way, that they are bringing to you things that you are surprised will be coming to market? Certainly, we have auctions upcoming that are coming to market that you are surprised to see.
Well, as I said, I've got a few large consignments where people have just decided to downsize, or they're
Right.
they're moving. But yeah, I mean, occasionally we get something that's just completely out of the blue.
What's the most surprising thing you have seen of late that has yet to come to auction?
Come to auction.
Here, at least.
Yeah.
And we, by the way, do have questions that are upcoming that have been
Okay.
emailed to Tommy, so we'll get to those in just a moment. While I have given Nigel a stumper here.
Yeah, I'm trying to think. Everything for the October sale comes in at the very last minute. It's always a surprise what the sale is going to look like. I will say that in April, we got this group of photographs by this photographer, Perkle Jones. Perkle Jones was a friend and contemporary of Ansel Adams. He took, large format, sharp photographs. But there was this body of work that nobody had seen before, where he was working for the California Roadside Council, photographing billboards in California. And because they wanted all the billboards removed, there were just too many billboards all across the highways. And it was a big movement to try to get, new regulations about this. And these are I've just never seen a group of photographs like this. People didn't know that he took this group of photographs. So that was a bit of a discovery.
I have to say, I have seen a lot of these photographs taken in Texas over the years. I love them because they certainly give you a sense of what we've lost.
Yeah, they really capture the era. Yeah, I think they're great.
Yeah, I really love these. I think these are the things, again, that I'm really drawn to. They are sort of remembrances of things past. They're photojournalism. They are art. There is that confluence of so many different things here. Tommy, I think you've got a couple of questions for us. If you'd like to pop on, if it's easier. Oh, here you go. Dell asks, can you speak of the care and safekeeping of the images in one collection? The importance of the recent occupation of photograph conservation should also be discussed. Do you have a best recommendation for taking care, I guess, of things that are not necessarily framed or stored that way?
Well, I mean, this is it. I mean, are you hanging your collection on the wall, or are you just keeping it for safekeeping? There are collectors who their whole collections are in drawers. they're not framing or hanging them on the walls.
Right.
And so, I mean, I will say that, in general, best thing to do is to, even black and white photographs, is to not hang them in direct sunlight, where they're getting hit by sun all day long. I had this a couple of years ago. I had this beautiful Richard Avedon, Nastasia Kinski and the Snake.
Right. So yeah,
which,
an image that immediately comes to mind.
You know that one. Yes, that's a famous one, and that's very desirable. Usually sell for like $60,000-$70,000. Somebody said they had one. I drove out to the Hamptons, which I don't know whether people know is like a beach community area on Long Island. I drove out to the Hamptons, and it had been hanging in their beach house for 30 years, getting sun every day, and it had turned brown.
Wow.
And I thought it wouldn't sell at all, because it had really turned, as we say. But we still got like $30,000 for it. But yeah, I mean, I would say, especially color photography, stay away from direct sunlight, put it in UV glass or UV plexi. There are different processes that are much more susceptible to damage or fading over time than others. The worst are like, standard Kodacolor, Ectacolor prints from the 1970s. They will fade unless they're kept in, dark storage.
Somebody asks here, obviously, about the photography of sports. What that particular, if there is an uptick in interest in sports. Bass says here, I'm having trouble finding those, especially of soccer. Again, that falls, I guess, in some realms to the photojournalism category. Certainly, sports photographers are taking those photographs, some of which we offer in the sports auctions. In fact, photographs, interestingly enough, have become very, very, very popular in the sports category these days, especially as they're typed, identified by PSA, which does card grading.
Yeah, it's funny how the photography market is actually segmented. Segmented. There are fine art photographs, which I deal in, which is where the photographer who took it is usually very important. Then you have historical photographs where it's a photograph of Lincoln, it's a photograph of Ulysses S. Grant, it's a Civil War battlefield, and those are sold in the historical department in their sales. And the sports photographs are sold in the sports department, and they're slabbed and graded like baseball cards, and it's a completely different field, collector base. And if there's a lack of soccer photographs, I can only think that the sports department thinks that there's a lack of soccer collectors. It's mainly baseball. I think that's most of the photographs in the sports.
Somebody asked, I guess, concerning sports photos in some ways, can press photos be also be considered type 1 if printed within 2 years of the photograph being taken?
Yeah, there are, and I have seen press photographs being graded. If we sell photographs in the photography department, we tend not to get them graded or slabbed. Our collectors don't really like them encapsulated in plastic. But I can
frame.
Yeah, I can understand the appeal. But yeah, when we do get press photographs, and they're usually just well-known ones, ones that have won Pulitzer Prizes, we don't grade them or slab them.
I will say one of my favorite collections we have sold since my 16, 17 months here at Heritage was the Ouija collection. I think that was one of the most remarkable finds that I had seen in a very long time.
Yeah, that was one of those great finds where he found it in a box in an antique shop in Philadelphia, 30 years ago, and didn't do anything with it. It was stored under his kitchen sink. And then he finally took out the box and realized that some of them had Ouija stamps on them and contacted me. But those were all vintage prints. Those were all prints from the 1930s. And some of them had tears and rips. And
to that point, somebody asks, I noticed in the photo, in the question earlier, we did not address photo conservation and restoration. Do you see a lot of that being done these days, and how significantly does that impact the value of a print if it has in fact been restored and it dates back to, say, the 1930s?
It's very difficult at auction, the issue of conservation and restoration, because if you've ever been to a photography conservator, they're incredibly expensive. It's usually like $800 for them to write a report about what treatment needs to be done. So you're usually talking about $1,000 or more to get some treatment done. So we have to be able to justify to the consignor, is spending this money on conservation going to increase the value enough to make it worthwhile? By us putting $1,000 into the photograph, is it going to increase the value by 5,000, 10,000? Right. And most of the time, it turns out that the cost of the conservation ship is not going to increase the value enough to make it really worthwhile.
But it doesn't decrease the value, right? Obviously, you don't want to polish a coin, an old coin. You don't want to do anything to a sports card to restore it. Or comic books also, whenever they go to CGC, they're certainly noted whether it's restored, whether it's, or whether it's an original condition. Does it make a significant difference when it comes to photos, whether they're restored or whether it should be in its original printing presentation?
Again, this has a lot to do with the value and the rarity.
Right.
Going back to that Edward Weston Pepper, if somebody's spending $300,000 for a photograph and it looks like it's had a crease repaired, or it's had a scratch retouched, they often want to see the conservation report. They want to see who did the work, when the work was done. So that's part of the history of the photograph,
right?
If any conservation has been done, and if it's been done, well, and it's done by a well-known conservator, it won't affect the value that much.
Sam asked, are silver-based prints worth more in general than inkjet prints?
I will say that it's a very good question. When inkjet prints started to come on the market about 20 years ago, there were collectors and dealers who were reluctant to deal in them. Collectors said, "Oh, I'm never going to collect an inkjet print." Fast forward 20 years, and every contemporary photographer is producing photographs in inkjet. So, if you collect contemporary photography, that's what you're collecting. I will say, if you're taking like for like, the same photograph by the same photographer, there are a few cases where they did do earlier prints in gelatin silver, and then their later prints are inkjet. Like one example would be Bert Stern and his Marilyn Monroe photographs.
Right.
He has some later digital editions. People will pay more for the gelatin silver print.
Excellent. Nigel, if folks have questions for you, if they have stuff they would like to consign with you, what is the best way for them to reach you?
Email. I'm in and out of the office, so sometimes phone doesn't, isn't the best. But I do answer my emails, and I can
Give them your address.
I can be reached at Nigel, that's Nigel, and then R for Russell, so Nigelr at ha.com.
Well, as always, it's fascinating that we went a little over an hour because folks had questions, but this is a subject in which I have great interest, so I appreciate you indulging me in this conversation. We'll do this again shortly, but obviously there is an auction in October. There are auctions throughout the month. They're available at all times. As you see, October 5th is the next signature, but there will be photography auctions certainly between now and then. And for those who want sports photos, hey, the sports signature platinum night is upcoming in August. So
yeah, we have our sorry to interrupt, but we have our depth of field monthly photography auction. So that's every month. And then the deadline for the big signature sale is the beginning of August.
So one best hustle to get your photographs to Nigel. Nigel, this has been a great joy for me to do this. Thanks very much for doing it. Thank you, everybody who joined us for questions and who is watching or has watched or will watch. We'll do this again shortly, but really, thanks again, Nigel.
Thank you. Take care.
You too.